Hi, my name is Barry. I am a live2d rigger/modeler. Today I will be explaining the technique I use to do hair physics without skinning. This is my first tutorial, but I would be happy to do more in the future if it's requested. I use this technique in my own model, so you can see how it looks when I move my head. With that, let's move on to the actual tutorial. For today's tutorial, I will be using ROZ's model, which was drawn by Miyu Aki. Their links are in the description below. First, I will talk about how I set up the parameters. The amount of physics parameters I set up for each strand of hair depends on how long the hair is. For these short bits of hair, I have two parameters. For the longer side bangs, such as here, I have 3. And for the long side hair, I have 4. For large amounts of hair, like the back hair, 3 or 4 is enough. I usually don't use more than 4 parameters. So here, I've set up the parameters to demonstrate each length of hair. I'll start with a short bang, the right bang. When I do hair physics, I use warp deformers for every parameter except the very last one. So in this case, the first parameter will be done with a warp deformer. Using the warp deformer, I usually divide it into 3 sections and move the bottom 2/3 left and right for horizontal movement. Once I've done it in one direction, I can use the reflect motion tool and reflect it horizontally for the other direction. For the second parameter, I'll use the art mesh. I use the deform path tool and mark out a path where it makes sense for the hair to bend. So it would look something like this. Then I move the bottom point left and right in a diagonal. So it's kind of like the hair is bouncing. I use extended interpolation from this menu and set it to ellipse. This way, the hair moves in an arc rather than in a straight line. It's a very subtle difference, but I like it. Now I will explain how I set up the physics. For the input, I usually use angle XYZ and also the breadth, so that there's slight movement of the hair when the model is idle. For the pendulums, I actually quite like the default hair double pendulum and triple pendulum presets. In this case, I use 2 parameters, so I'll choose hair double pendulum. Here in the inputs, you can see angle X and angle Y are used as position inputs, while angle Z and breadth are used as angle inputs. In the output, I will add the 2 parameters I just finished. The result looks like this. This is the exact bang. Now I will apply this technique to a slightly longer bang. For this one, I have 3 parameters. I'll create a warp deformer for the first 2 parameters. For the first parameter, I divide the warp deformer into 3 and move the bottom 2/3 left and right just like before. I again use the reflect motion tool to reflect it horizontally. For the second parameter, I divide the warp deformer in half instead of in 3s and move the bottom half left and right. I reflect the motion horizontally again, and it looks like this. Now, since I use the same warp deformer for both parameters, I need to synthesize the corners or else it'll look funky. So now it looks something like this. For the last parameter, it's time to use the art mesh again. I use the deform path tool again, like this. Then I move the bottom point again. And use extended interpolation ellipse. In the physics settings, I will use the same inputs I did for the short bang. However, for the pendulums, since I have 3 parameters, I'll use the triple pendulum default. In the output, I add the parameters I just finished. And this is how it looks, this bang right here. For one last example, I will apply this technique to the long side hair. For this one, I'll use 4 parameters. This means I will be using a warp deformer for the first 3 parameters. However, a single warp deformer should only have 2 parameters associated with it as a best practice. So I will create 2 warp deformers. We start with the outer warp deformer, and for the first parameter, I divide the warp deformer into 3 again and move the bottom 2/3 left and right. For the second parameter, I change the number of divisions to 2 and move the bottom half left and right. I synthesize the corners for this deformer. Then I move to the inner warp deformer, and I divide it into 3, but this time I only move the bottom 1/3 left and right. So these two interact something like this. Finally, for the last parameter, I use the art mesh like before. I set up the deform path, and I move it left and right. Then I use extended interpolation and set it to ellipse. In the physics settings, I will use the same input as before. However, for the pendulums, I will start with the triple pendulum default and add a 4th pendulum since we have 4 parameters. For the 4th pendulum, I will follow a similar pattern as the first 3. I also tend to change the duration from the default for longer pieces of hair, since longer hair moves less bouncily than short hair. So I would do something like this. I add in the parameters I just finished, and it looks something like this. Finally, I will explain the technique I use for the back hair like this. It's also the technique I tend to use for other types of hair like twintails. I'll be using 3 parameters. Again, I will use warp deformers for all the parameters except the last one. However, in this case, instead of moving around the green boxes, I will be using the deform brush tool. For the first parameter, I will find the curve in the hair closest to the top of the head. So that's like right here. I move this curve inward and outward. For the next parameter, I find the next place that the hair curves. So that's around here, and move that inward and outward. I have to synthesize the corners, but once I do, you can see that the hair moves in a smooth motion like this. For the last parameter, we will go to the arm mesh. I set up the deform path like this. Move the bottom point. And again, use extended interpolation ellipse. In the physics, I will use the same input as before and the triple pendulum, since we have 3 parameters. Just like before, I will extend the duration since the hair is very long. Then I go to output and add the parameters I just finished. And this is the result. That's the end of the tutorial. I hope it was helpful to you. If you have any questions, you can leave a comment or DM me on Twitter. I'm always happy to help. You can find my commission info and socials in the description box below. Thank you for watching.